Sometimes life hides extraordinary stories in the most ordinary places. On a quiet morning flight, a humble single-dad janitor was forced out of first class until a single glimpse of the tattoo on his back stopped the pilot cold. What happened next changed everyone on that plane. Forever. Before we begin, if you believe that kindness, courage, and love still have the power to change lives, we warmly invite you to join our channel. Subscribe, sit back, and let's journey together through stories that heal, inspire, and remind us what truly matters. Now, let's begin the story. The terminal buzzed with the constant hum of travelers, families hugging businessmen tapping at phones, and the overhead voice announcing boarding calls that echoed through the glass hall of Los Angeles International Airport. Amid the blur of motion stood Michael Bray, his weathered green jacket hanging loose on broad shoulders that once carried 1,000 pounds of silence. Beside him, Sophie clutched a paper envelope like it was treasure. Her curls bounced as she jumped in excitement. "Daddy, hurry. We'll miss it." Michael smiled faintly. He was in no rush. Airports were his second home, just not from this side of the gate. For years, he'd pushed a mop through these same terminals, his badge reading Janitorial Services, Air America Airlines. The floor had always gleamed because of him. The seats had been spotless for people like those rushing past, now people who never looked twice at the man in the green uniform. But today, for the first time, Michael wasn't here to clean. He was here to fly. Sophie tore open the envelope and waved 2 glossy tickets with the triumph of a magician revealing a secret. "Look, first class. They said it's the best seats ever." Michael froze for a heartbeat. "First class," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "Sweetheart, that's too much. Maybe they printed it wrong." She shook her head with fierce conviction. "It's not wrong. Mrs. Jacobs from the community center helped me. She said it's a thank you trip for all the help you give the veterans there. We're going to Washington, Daddy. You can't clean floors forever." He chuckled softly, though something tugged deep inside him. "I'm not cleaning forever, Peanut. Just long enough to keep the lights on." Sophie frowned. "You always fix everyone's mess. You should get to sit where the seats are soft for once." Her words landed harder than she knew. For years, Michael had made peace with his smallness, his quiet existence sweeping corridors instead of flying through them. The Navy SEAL insignia inked into his back was a secret under layers of humility and denim. That chapter of life, the one full of adrenaline and brothers lost to the sea, was sealed shut. Still, when Sophie looked up at him with that glimmer of pride, something inside stirred. He knelt down and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You really want me to go?" She nodded solemnly. "You cleaned the whole world for people to fly. Now it's your turn to sit in it." The words disarmed him completely. He looked down at the tickets again. First class, row 1A and 1B, a gift from the child who had already given him everything worth living for. "All right," he whispered. "Let's go see how the other half flies." The plane gleamed under the California sunlight, its white fuselage reflecting the morning sky. Sophie tugged her tiny suitcase, behind her stickers of stars and dolphins peeling at the corners. As they boarded, a few passengers glanced their way, some curious, others indifferent. Michael's jacket bore the faint scent of cleaning solvent. It had been his work uniform for years. They reached the first-class cabin, a stretch of leather seats and quiet whispers. Sophie's eyes widened. "Daddy, it's like a movie." Michael chuckled softly, but his stomach tightened. He could feel eyes on them, expensive eyes that measured everything from the scuffs on his boots to the calluses on his hands. A man in a tailored blazer muttered to his wife. "They must have wandered in from economy." The woman's polite laugh cut sharper than it should have. Michael pretended not to hear. He lifted Sophie onto her seat and tucked her blanket around her legs. Seatbelt on Peanut. "You're the captain now." The sound of clicking heels drew closer. A woman with a perfect bun and crisp uniform stopped beside them. Her name tag read, Tessa Morgan, Chief Flight Attendant. Her professional smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, sir," she said. "May I see your boarding passes?" Michael handed them over. She scanned the tickets, then frowned slightly. "These are for first class," Sophie piped up proudly. "Uh-huh. We're flying to Washington for my contest. My dad's the guest of honor." Tessa hesitated. The couple across the aisle exchanged looks. Michael could feel his pulse in his throat. Sir Tessa said gently, "I believe there's been a mistake. First class is reserved for priority passengers. Perhaps you were upgraded by accident." Michael's jaw flexed. He could feel Sophie watching him, her little hand gripping his sleeve. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "the tickets were gifted to us. They're valid." Tessa's tone softened, but stayed firm. "I understand, sir, but I need to confirm with the gate." Sophie's lip trembled. "We didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. Michael forced a smile, leaning close to her. Hey, sometimes grown-ups just need a minute to catch up, okay?" He looked up at Tessa again, still polite but unbending. "You can check, but I'll stand right here." She nodded uneasy. "Please wait just a moment." As she walked away, whispers fluttered through the cabin like leaves in the wind. Unbelievable. Some people don't know their place. Janitor, maybe Michael, kept his eyes fixed on the window, the blue sky reflecting against his calm expression. But inside, shame and anger wrestled silently. Sophie tugged his sleeve again. "Daddy." He turned. "Why are they being mean?" His throat tightened. He wanted to tell her the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes kindness wore a broom and arrogance wore a suit, but he just smiled the way only a father could when the truth would hurt too much. "Because they don't know us yet," he said softly. "Sometimes silence teaches people louder than words." She blinked. "Like how you never yell but everyone listens anyway." Michael chuckled. "Something like that." Tessa returned a moment later, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, the system confirms your tickets are valid. My apologies for the misunderstanding." Michael nodded, no resentment in his eyes. No harm done. But as she turned away, the damage lingered in the air like static. He could see it in Sophie's furrowed brow, her innocence bruised by the world's quiet cruelty. He leaned closer and whispered, "Hey, Peanut. You know what's funny? First class doesn't make the sky any closer. We all fly the same distance." Her smile returned, small but bright. "Then let's fly higher than them, Daddy," he grinned. "Deal." As the engines roared and the cabin lights dimmed, Michael closed his eyes for a moment. Beneath the hum of turbines, memories flickered the ocean spray, the gunfire, the silent waves that carried away men he once called brothers. The seal tattoo on his back burned like a brand beneath his shirt, invisible but alive. He exhaled slowly. That life is gone, he told himself. This one's enough. Beside him, Sophie had already fallen asleep, her head resting on his arm. Outside, the plane lifted off the ground, slicing through clouds that shimmered gold in the morning light. Michael gazed out the window, the city shrinking below him. It wasn't the altitude that made his chest ache. It was the thought that maybe he was finally rising again. And somewhere deep inside he could almost hear a voice from the past, gravelly proud and kind. Fly safe, Bray. The world's gonna need your kind on the ground someday. He smiled faintly, whispering to the window. Still here, brother, still flying. The plane leveled into the morning sky, sunlight spilling through the oval windows in golden ribbons. The clouds below looked like endless fields of cotton, soft and peaceful, a quiet disguise for the turbulence that brewed in the human heart. Michael Bray leaned back in his seat, trying to enjoy the calm hum of flight. Sophie, still small enough to marvel at every blinking light and every sound from the cockpit, pressed her nose against the window. "Daddy," she whispered, "we're above the clouds. It looks like heaven." He smiled. Maybe that's what heaven is, Peanut, quiet and full of light. For a brief moment, peace settled over him. But it didn't last. He could feel the glances, not the curious kind, the kind that weighs a man. Across the aisle, a woman with pearl earrings leaned closer to her husband. "I'm sure the airline made a mistake," she murmured, her voice just loud enough to slice through the hush. "You can tell by the jacket." Her husband chuckled softly. Blue-collar folks shouldn't pretend. Michael heard every word. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He'd faced worse. Bullets, storms, silence after explosions. This just noise. But Sophie turned, confusion painting her little face. "Daddy, why are they whispering?" He hesitated. "Because sometimes people forget kindness when they climb too high." Her brows furrowed as she thought about it. "Then they should come down." Michael couldn't help but laugh quietly. Maybe they will someday. A few seats away, Tessa Morgan, the chief flight attendant, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled since takeoff. The man in 1A looked out of place. His posture was too upright, his silence too steady. Something about him defied her usual categories. As she poured champagne for another passenger, a woman in the next row leaned in. "Tessa, dear," she whispered conspiratorially, "are you sure that man's supposed to be here? He doesn't look first class." Tessa offered a diplomatic smile. "Everyone on this flight is where they're meant to be, ma'am." But the woman pressed. "I've flown this route for years. I've never seen anyone like that in this cabin. The child's adorable, of course, but still, doesn't it make you wonder?" Tessa exhaled slowly. The words scratched at something inside her, her instinct for order, her years of training to maintain perfection in the air. She looked toward 1A again. The man wasn't reading, wasn't sleeping. He was simply watching, not with suspicion, but with awareness. Then Sophie's laugh rang out, bright innocent. She had folded a napkin into a paper swan and placed it on her tray. "Look, Daddy, it's flying too." The sound made several passengers glance over again. A businessman frowned, clearly annoyed by the disturbance. Tessa's professionalism kicked in. She walked toward them with a polite smile. "Sir, miss, may I offer you something to drink?" Sophie looked up eagerly. "Can I have apple juice, please?" "Of course." Tessa turned to Michael. "And for you, sir?" He smiled gently. "Just water." "Thank you." When she returned a moment later, Sophie thanked her earnestly. "You're really nice. Daddy says people who fly planes are brave." Tessa softened a little. "Your father sounds wise." Michael met her eyes for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement. But before it could linger, another passenger called out impatiently for service. Tessa excused herself. Minutes stretched into quiet. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane reached cruising altitude. Sophie leaned against Michael's arm, drawing shapes on the fogged window. "Daddy, do you think angels use airplanes?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe. But I think angels prefer wings that don't need fuel." She giggled. "Like yours." Michael blinked. "What do you mean?" "When you pick me up, it feels like flying." The words hit him like sunlight through storm clouds, simple, pure, disarming. He brushed her hair gently and whispered, "You're my best co-pilot, kiddo." She nodded proudly, then yawned. "You promise we'll see the Lincoln statue tomorrow?" "Promise," he said. "And we'll get ice cream after." Her eyelids fluttered. "Even if it's cold, even then." She smiled, drifting off to sleep. As the minutes passed, the whispering resumed behind them. a soft hum of judgment threading through the hum of the engines. Doesn't he look too young for first class? Probably some charity case. Or worse, one of those veterans pretending to be something he's not. The words sank into Michael's ears like gravel. He didn't turn around. His eyes stayed fixed on the clouds. Silence is stronger, he reminded himself. You don't need to fight every battle. But inside, he could feel the old pulse returning, the one that used to rise before combat. The discipline that came from knowing when to act and when to endure. He took a slow breath and looked down at Sophie's sleeping face. Her tiny fingers curled around his hand. The storm in his chest quieted instantly. She's why you walk away, he whispered to himself. She's why you let it go. Still, the tension in the cabin was thick. Even Tessa noticed it as she walked past again. The businessman had his arms crossed, clearly disapproving of the intruder. The older couple whispered behind their hands. Tessa stopped her professionalism flickering into humanity. "Sir," she said softly, "I'm sorry if anyone's made you uncomfortable." Michael looked up, surprised by her honesty. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Some lessons take time to learn." Tessa hesitated. "You handle it better than most would." He smiled faintly. "I've been in rougher cabins," her brow furrowed, unsure if he was joking. Something in his tone hinted at experience, authority even. But before she could ask, the intercom crackled. "This is your captain speaking. We'll be experiencing light turbulence shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." Tessa nodded and moved down the aisle to ensure compliance. Michael buckled Sophie's belt gently without waking her. As the plane began to tremble lightly, a few passengers gasped. Michael stayed still, his expression unreadable. The rumble was nothing compared to the things he'd survived, nothing compared to the sound of rotor blades in hostile skies, or waves crashing against steel hulls. Then, just as quickly, the turbulence eased. When the seatbelt sign dimmed again, the tension in the cabin didn't fully lift. There was still that invisible wall, the one built by class, pride, and misunderstanding. Michael leaned back, closing his eyes. He could almost hear Sophie's voice in his head. "They should come down," he smiled faintly. "Maybe they will, Peanut," he murmured. "Maybe they will." At the rear of the first-class cabin, Tessa paused to write a quick note in her crew log, but her mind wasn't on the page. It was on the quiet man in seat 1. The way he had stayed calm, the way he spoke to his daughter, the way he carried something unspoken on his shoulders. She had served thousands of passengers in her career. She could read people like weather. And this one, she thought, wasn't who everyone assumed he was. As she turned toward the cockpit, she caught a glimpse of the pilot's reflection in the narrow window, Captain Amelia Hart. The captain's calm face mirrored professionalism itself. Yet when Amelia's gaze flicked briefly toward the cabin toward 1A, something unreadable passed across her eyes. Tessa couldn't have known it yet, but that glance would change everything. Back in his seat, Michael watched the sunlight fading beyond the wing, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sophie stirred beside him, half awake. "Daddy, yes, Peanut. Are we almost there?" He smiled softly. "Almost. Just a little while longer. Then can we sit here again next time?" He paused. "Maybe. But it's not the seat that matters, remember." She smiled sleepily. "It's who sits with you." Michael nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Exactly." And as the engines hummed them through the clouds, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere ahead in the quiet corridors of fate, something was waiting to wake up the world around him. Something that would begin with a single, frozen salute. The air inside the cabin had grown thick, too still, too heavy for comfort. The whispers had not stopped. They had merely sunk to a frequency of quiet contempt. Michael Bray felt them like static against his skin. He didn't need to hear every word. He could feel what they meant. When the seatbelt sign blinked off again, Tessa Morgan returned her heels, clicking softly on the aisle carpet. Her professional smile was back in place, but her eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Sir," she began, holding a small device in her hand. "I'm afraid there's been a new issue with your tickets. The manifest is showing a duplicate entry for your seats. There might have been a system error." Michael looked up from the small hand that still slept in his own. Sophie's head rested against his arm, her curls spilling over his sleeve like sunlight. "A system error," he repeated quietly. "Yes," Tessa said, shifting slightly. "I'll need to ask you to step to the galley area while we sort it out." He stared at her for a long second. Her tone was polite, almost apologetic, but the looks from the other passengers were not. A man in the next row smirked. "Knew it?" He muttered to his wife. "Karma always finds a way." The woman hid a smile behind her magazine. Michael exhaled slowly, his patience stretching thin. He had spent a lifetime keeping storms beneath the surface. He wanted to protect Sophie from scenes like this, from the world's casual cruelty. But when Tessa reached to touch his shoulder gently, he said calm but firm, "If there's an issue, we can talk right here. My daughter's sleeping." Her professionalism cracked for just a second. "Sir, please. This isn't personal. It's just procedure." He looked up at her eyes, steady. "Ma'am, I've lived long enough to know that when people say it's not personal, it usually is." Tessa's breath caught. Around them, the hum of quiet judgment swelled again. Sophie stirred, blinking sleep from her eyes. Daddy Michael immediately softened his tone. "It's okay, Peanut. Go back to sleep." But the little girl had already caught the tension. She looked up at the flight attendant. "Did we do something wrong?" Tessa's voice wavered slightly. "No, sweetheart. There's just been a mistake." Michael gave a slow nod. "There's no mistake, ma'am. Just a misunderstanding." He unbuckled his seatbelt and rose, careful not to wake Sophie fully. "Let's get this cleared up so no one else has to be uncomfortable." He turned to lift his small carry-on from the overhead bin. As he reached up the hem of his jacket, lifted just enough for the fabric of his old shirt to shift, and that's when it happened. A flicker of gold and black ink caught the light. The seal trident. A trident piercing the ocean's surface. The eagle, the anchor, the pistol, and the trident itself etched deep into skin that had seen salt fire and loss. For a second, no one spoke. Then came the sound of a breath being drawn sharply. From the cockpit doorway, Captain Amelia Hart had stepped out, something few captains ever did mid-flight. She had come to check the commotion in first class after a call from her crew, but what she saw froze her mid-stride. Her gaze locked onto Michael's back on the tattoo she knew too well. Her pupils dilated, the air caught in her throat. That emblem wasn't decoration. It wasn't imitation. It was earned through blood, through brotherhood, through the kind of silence that came after losing people you swore you'd bring home. She knew because she had flown missions with those men. She had buried one of them herself. "Lieutenant," she whispered, before she even realized she'd spoken aloud. Michael turned slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly in recognition, not of her face, but of the weight in her voice. Their gazes met. For a brief electric second, time itself seemed to still. Tessa blinked, startled by the sudden presence of her captain. Captain Hart. Amelia raised a hand gently, her eyes never leaving Michael. "What's going on here?" Tessa straightened immediately. "There was a ticket issue, ma'am. I was just asking the passenger to step aside." Amelia's expression hardened, cutting through the noise like a blade. This passenger, her voice carried authority, low-measured and unmistakable, the kind of tone that silenced rooms. Tessa swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. But I was just—" The captain's voice softened, but it held something deeper now, something reverent. "You're dismissed for the moment, Miss Morgan." Tessa froze, stunned. Ma'am. Amelia turned her head slightly. "That's an order." The entire cabin had gone silent. The businessman stopped pretending not to stare. Even the woman with the pearls lowered her magazine. Michael stood there still and composed, but the shift in the air made him uneasy. "Captain," he said. Voice. Even. "I don't want trouble. We're fine." But Amelia wasn't listening to excuses. She stepped closer, her posture straightening into a salute that came from muscle memory, older than the aircraft itself. "Lieutenant Michael Bray," she said quietly, each word trembling with a restrained emotion. "Operation Ironhaven 2010, Neptune Spear Support Unit." The color drained from Tessa's face. The passengers looked between them confused, as if watching a language they didn't understand. Michael's eyes darkened. That was a long time ago. Amelia nodded once. "Not long enough for me to forget. You pulled me out of the water that night. I was the pilot of Hawk 3. The words landed like thunder. Michael's breath hitched. He looked at her properly, now saw past the uniform, past the command, and into the memory of fire on the horizon. "You were on that chopper. I was the one who thought we'd never make it home," Amelia said softly, "but you made sure we did." The silence that followed was heavier than sound. Every eye in the cabin turned toward Michael, but now the looks were different, softer, ashamed. Tessa's hands trembled as she tried to find words. I didn't know," Michael sighed, shaking his head. "You weren't supposed to." But Amelia wasn't done. She took a step back, straightened again, and raised her hand in a crisp, precise military salute. To him. In the middle of first class, every passenger froze the gravity of the moment, pulling them into stillness. Even Sophie, half awake, blinked in confusion as she looked up at the woman in the pilot's uniform, standing tall before her father. Michael stood motionless, his throat tightening. It had been years since anyone had saluted him. The gesture carried the weight of ghosts of loyalty loss and unspoken gratitude. Finally, Amelia lowered her hand. Her voice, though steady, carried the echo of old emotion. "You saved my life, Lieutenant, and it seems fate wanted me to return the favor by reminding others who you are." She turned toward the cabin crew, her tone switching to command. "This man and his daughter will remain in seats. 1A and 1B. That's not a request. It's a directive from the captain of this aircraft." Then she looked directly at Tessa. "Apologize to them." The flight attendant's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, sir." "Ma'am, I truly didn't." Michael held up a hand gently. "It's all right. You were doing your job." Amelia's lips curved faintly, still defending everyone else. Some things never change. He met her gaze, the corner of his mouth, lifting just a little. Some habits are hard to break. Sophie reached for his hand, eyes wide. "Daddy, are you famous?" He chuckled softly. "No peanut, just old." Laughter broke the tension in the air, a wave of relief and humility washing over the cabin. Even the passengers who had mocked him moments ago couldn't look him in the eye. As Amelia turned to return to the cockpit, she paused and glanced back. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the silence. "Welcome aboard, Lieutenant." Michael nodded once. "Thank you, Captain." And as he sat back down beside his daughter, the hum of the engines returned, steady, rhythmic, and somehow lighter than before. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel small. He simply felt seen. The cabin remained suspended in silence long after Captain Amelia Hart returned to the cockpit. The air felt different now, charged, reverent, almost sacred. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The sound of the engines filled the quiet, steady, and powerful, like the heartbeat of something larger than all of them. Michael Bray sat back down slowly, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. Sophie leaned into his arm, her bright eyes wide with wonder. "Daddy," she whispered, "why did the pilot salute you?" He gave a faint, weary smile. "Because once a long time ago I did something I was supposed to do." That's all she asked innocently. That's everything he said softly. Up in the cockpit, Captain Amelia Hart sat in her seat, the glow of the instrument panel washing her face in dim amber light. Her co-pilot, a younger man named Reyes, glanced at her, visibly puzzled. "Captain?" "What just happened back there?" he asked. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I just met a ghost I didn't know I was waiting to see again." Reyes hesitated. "You knew that passenger," Amelia exhaled slowly. "Lieutenant Michael Bray, SEAL Team 7. He pulled my crew out of the sea during Ironhaven 2010. Reyes blinked. "You mean the mission that went dark off Aden Gulf?" She nodded. "They called it a rescue op, but it was more like resurrection. 2 birds went down. I should have been number 3. Her voice dropped, trembling just slightly. "He dragged me through oil debris and shrapnel. When I woke up in a med tent, they said he'd vanished, left service without ceremony." The cockpit went quiet again, except for the hum of the controls. Amelia's knuckles tightened on the yoke. And now he's sitting back there, holding his daughter, getting treated like a trespasser. Reyes glanced at her. "Ma'am, you did the right thing." She nodded slowly, but her chest ached with something deeper. "Guilt, respect, maybe both. It's funny," she murmured. "We salute medals and forget men." He had every reason to disappear. Back in the cabin, Tessa Morgan struggled to regain composure. She moved quietly down the aisle, adjusting a curtain, rearranging trays, anything to occupy her hands. Her face was pale, her usual poise cracked. She stopped beside Michael's row. "Sir," she began, carefully, "would you like something to drink on the house?" Michael looked up, his expression calm. "Water's fine." Tessa hesitated. I didn't mean to treat you unfairly. I just—" He cut in gently. "You saw what you were trained to see." Her eyes glistened. "I saw a man who didn't belong." He gave a faint, forgiving smile. "Now you know none of us really do. We just try to fit where we can." That line landed somewhere deep in her. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked away quietly. Around the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers who had whispered before now looked at him with quiet respect, though guilt shadowed every glance. A businessman who had laughed earlier cleared his throat awkwardly and asked, "Sir, if I may thank you for your service." Michael didn't respond right away. He simply gave a nod and said, "You don't have to thank me. Just treat people well. That's all any of us ever fought for." The man swallowed hard, humbled, and turned away. A light ding echoed overhead, the signal for intercom communication. A soft chime followed by Amelia's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to extend my personal thanks for your patience earlier. Sometimes life gives us small moments that remind us who we are. I hope today's flight is one of those." The cabin was silent as her words sank in. Sophie turned to her father. "She's talking about you." Michael smiled slightly. "No, Peanut. She's talking about everyone." Later, when most passengers had dozed off, Amelia emerged once more. The lights were low, the world outside a deep, peaceful blue. She paused near the galley, watching Michael from afar. He sat awake, gaze lost beyond the glass. The moonlight caught the tired lines of his face, the kind carved not by years, but by memory. She approached quietly. "Could we talk for a moment?" Michael turned, his expression cautious, but kind. "Of course, Captain." She gestured toward the cockpit door. "Would you like to see where the view's better?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Been a while since I was invited to the front of a bird." Sophie stirred. "Where are you going, Daddy?" "To see the stars from the front seat," he said softly. "You sleep tight." Inside the cockpit, the lights glowed in amber and cobalt instruments, flickering like constellations. The earth stretched below them, dark and endless. Amelia motioned toward the co-pilot's seat. "Go ahead." Michael sat, posture instinctively straight. His eyes scanned the gauges, the horizon, the hum of stability. For a second, muscle memory took over. He knew the rhythm, the sound, the silence between transmissions. Amelia watched him quietly. "You still read skies like maps." He smiled faintly. "Hard to forget how even when you try." They sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again, her tone softer. "Why did you walk away, Lieutenant?" He took a breath, long and steady. "Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying in the fight. It's learning how to stop." She studied him. "And the little girl, Sophie," he said the name, carrying warmth. "Her mom died while I was deployed. I came back with medals and an empty house. She was 2. I promised her I'd never leave her for another war." Amelia's throat tightened. "You kept that promise." "I try," he said quietly. "But some battles follow you home." For a moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of flight. Amelia turned to look at him, her voice low. "When you left that night in 2010, I never got to say thank you." Michael shook his head. "You just did." She smiled faintly. "You're not the man I expected to find today." "Neither are you," he replied softly. "I thought pilots forgot us once the engines cooled." Amelia let out a quiet laugh. Some memories don't fade with altitude. They shared a silence that felt like understanding. 2 lives separated by war and stitched together by gratitude. Then a chime interrupted the moment, Tessa's voice over intercom. "Captain, the passengers are asking if you're okay. They said you've been gone a while." Amelia smiled. "Tell them their captain is catching up with an old friend." She looked back at Michael. "You can visit any time you want, Lieutenant. You'll always have a seat here." He smiled faintly. "Appreciate it, Captain. But I think I prefer cleaning the floor to flying above it these days." Her eyes softened. "You still fly, you just do it differently now." Michael stood, offering his hand. She shook it firmly, the grip of equals of survivors. As he stepped out of the cockpit, Amelia whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear. "Respect doesn't need a uniform." He turned, gave her a knowing nod, and walked back down the aisle toward Sophie, his daughter, his anchor, his peace. When he sat down, she stirred again, and mumbled. "You saw the stars, Daddy." He smiled, brushing her hair. "Yeah, Peanut." And one of them said, "Thank you." At 30,000 feet under the quiet sweep of clouds and moonlight, the cabin of Flight 218 became more than a place in the sky. It became a bridge between past and present, between war and healing, between those who fly and those who choose to land. And for the first time in years, Michael Bray didn't feel like he was running from his past. He felt like he was finally flying toward it. By the time the plane crossed into the amber horizon, most of the passengers had settled into a reverent quiet. Even the chatter of first class, once filled with champagne laughter and casual superiority, had given way to something more fragile, almost introspective. The air had changed after that salute. No one quite knew how to speak into the silence that followed an act of genuine respect. Only 2 people remained fully awake: Captain Amelia Hart, whose steady hands guided the aircraft through an ocean of clouds, and Michael Bray, who stared at the reflection of the moon on the cabin window, lost in memories that would never truly sleep. He didn't notice the soft footsteps until they stopped beside him. "Lieutenant," came a voice he'd learned to recognize now, calm, disciplined, yet threaded with warmth. He looked up. Amelia stood there again, this time without the shield of rank. The brim of her cap was gone. Her sleeves rolled neatly above her wrists. She looked less like a pilot, more like a woman who'd carried too much sky inside her chest. "Captain," he said quietly. She gestured toward the cockpit. "Sophie's asleep. Thought maybe you'd join me for a minute. I owe you a proper conversation." Michael hesitated. "You don't owe me anything." Her smile was gentle. "I do. You saved my life. I think I can buy you 5 minutes of air." He looked down at Sophie's small hand curled around his. Carefully, he tucked her blanket tighter, kissed her forehead, and followed Amelia toward the cockpit. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a soft copper glow. The hum of the instruments was steady like the breathing of a giant. Amelia gestured for him to sit in the co-pilot's chair again. "You can relax," she said. "You're not under review." Michael smiled faintly. Hard habit to break. For a few moments they simply sat, two silhouettes against the stars. Below them the world stretched endless and dark, a patchwork of forgotten lights. Amelia was the first to speak. "I read every report after Ironhaven. They said you went MIA after extraction. No one ever knew what happened." Michael's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "That's because I didn't want to be found," she asked quietly. He leaned back, exhaling. "You remember what that mission was like? We weren't supposed to come back." Amelia nodded slowly. 2 teams lost. 7 men in the sea. 8, he corrected softly, including my commanding officer. He died in my arms before the second wave hit. He told me, "Don't chase glory. Chase life." The words hung in the air like a prayer. "I got Sophie's picture in the mail 2 weeks later," he continued. "Her mom sent it from home, said she'd drawn a picture of me with wings. I'd spent a lifetime fighting to prove I could protect people. But I couldn't even protect my own family from being lonely." Amelia's throat tightened. "So you left?" He nodded. "Turned in my badge, walked out the same gate I'd walked through at 20. I cleaned floors because I didn't want power anymore. I wanted peace. I wanted Sophie to grow up knowing kindness mattered more than medals." Amelia studied him, her eyes reflecting the flicker of dashboard light. "You did what most men can't learn to live after the war's over." Michael gave a dry laugh. "Living's harder than fighting. At least in combat you know who the enemy is." She leaned forward slightly. "And yet, even cleaning airport floors, you carried that insignia on your back." He turned his gaze toward her, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "That tattoo isn't pride. It's a reminder. Every morning when I put on my uniform, I see it in the mirror. It reminds me that I'm still accountable to them. Them, the men who didn't get to leave the ocean," he said. "I owe them a good life, a quiet one. Every day I live decent. I keep their memory alive." Amelia looked away for a moment, blinking back the emotion in her eyes. "That's the kind of strength people don't see, the kind they mistake for weakness." He shrugged. "Let them mistake it. I'm done explaining myself to people who don't understand." There was a long pause. The hum of the engines filled it. Outside, the sky deepened from navy to black. Amelia spoke again, softer now. "Do you ever miss it?" He chuckled under his breath. "The noise, the missions, the orders, not really, but sometimes." He glanced at her, a wistful look flickering in his eyes. "Sometimes I miss the sound of people who knew what loyalty meant." She nodded slowly. "That's what I miss too." Their eyes met again, 2 soldiers in different uniforms, both carrying ghosts stitched into the seams of their souls. Then Amelia smiled faintly, trying to lighten the air. "You know, when I saw that tattoo earlier, I thought I was seeing things. I hadn't heard your name in over a decade. Then I remembered the mission logs, Lieutenant Michael Bray's status presumed KIA. I almost dropped my headset." Michael chuckled quietly. "Sorry to ruin the mystery. It's the best mystery I've had in years," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You stayed in the sky all this time. It's all I know," she admitted. "The sky doesn't judge. It just listens. Same reason I mop floors, he said with a faint grin. They don't talk back either. Amelia laughed softly, then fell quiet again. You know, I used to think bravery meant staying in uniform, but tonight reminded me it also means walking away when you're tired of war. He tilted his head. You sound like someone who's still fighting one. She looked out the window. Maybe. The uniform hides it better, that's all. The radio crackled softly, a routine transmission from air traffic control. Amelia adjusted the knobs, answered calmly, then turned back to him. We'll be descending in an hour, she said. You should get some rest. Michael shook his head. Haven't slept through turbulence in 20 years. She studied him for a long beat. You ever think of writing this down, your story, I mean? People could learn from it. He smiled wistfully. People don't listen to janitors, Captain. They might, she said gently, if one of them once saved the world. He laughed, but it was a sad laugh. The world doesn't need saving, Amelia. Just a little more kindness. Her eyes softened. Then maybe you're the one teaching it now. When Michael returned to his seat, Sophie was still asleep, her tiny fingers holding the corner of his jacket like a promise. He brushed a kiss on her forehead and settled beside her. The engines hummed like a lullaby. From the cockpit, Amelia's voice came over the intercom once more, low, calm, and tender. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent shortly. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us. And to those who serve quietly on the ground or in the sky, this flight is for you. Michael closed his eyes and smiled. He didn't need medals. He didn't need seats or salutes. He had something far rarer, a peace he'd earned the hard way. As the plane glided through layers of twilight, the moonlight brushed the seal tattoo beneath his shirt, catching it for one brief shimmer, like a memory exhaling at last. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt human again. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber as Flight 218 carved its way eastward through the thinning clouds. Outside, the world was ink and starlight. Inside, the hush of the engines blended with the quiet breathing of passengers, each caught in their own small orbit of thought. Michael Bray sat in the half-dark, his jacket folded neatly beside him. Sophie slept soundly, her head resting on his shoulder, one tiny hand still gripping the sleeve of his shirt. The simple weight of her trust steadied him. After all these years, she was his compass, pointing him toward gentler skies. From the cockpit, Captain Amelia Hart's voice drifted through the intercom. Calm, warm, commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, we're flying at 32,000 feet with a tailwind that should bring us to D.C. ahead of schedule. Please enjoy the quiet while it lasts. Her tone carried an ease that only seasoned pilots mastered the calm of someone who'd learned how to steady the world when it shook. Michael smiled faintly at that. But as the night deepened, a low rumble began to roll through the fuselage, subtle at first like distant thunder. He felt it before anyone else did. A soft tremor under his boots, a vibration too familiar to ignore. The instincts drilled into him years ago flickered awake, uninvited. He glanced toward the window. The horizon outside had disappeared into a wall of gray. The seatbelt sign blinked on with a gentle chime. Ladies and gentlemen, Amelia's voice came again, this time more measured. We're entering a patch of mild turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts. Mild. Michael's gut told him otherwise. The first jolt came suddenly, a hard, sharp drop that sent gasps through the cabin. Glasses rattled. A child somewhere in coach cried out. Sophie stirred her small body, tensing against his arm. Daddy, it's okay, Peanut. He fastened her belt snugly. Just a few bumps. Tessa Morgan hurried down the aisle, one hand braced against the overhead compartment. Her professional smile was back, though her knuckles were white around the drink tray she was trying to secure. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," she said, her voice steady but clipped. "It'll pass shortly." Another jolt, harder this time, snapped the tray loose from her grasp. A glass tumbled shattering at her feet. The cabin pitched sideways. Passengers gasped, clutching their armrests. Michael moved before he thought. Years of combat reflex compressed into a heartbeat. He reached across the aisle, bracing a panicking man's shoulder. "Feet, stay low. You'll feel steadier." The man obeyed instantly. Something in Michael's tone cut through the fear. Then the plane lurched again, the tail buffeted by an updraft. The overhead bin above Tessa burst open, a duffel bag sliding free. Michael was already out of his seat. He caught it mid-fall, the strap whipping against his forearm. He shoved it back in, locked the latch, and turned to Tessa. "You okay?" She nodded shakily, one hand pressed to her arm. "Cut just glass." He tore a napkin from the galley and wrapped it around her wrist with the practiced efficiency of a field medic. "Pressure here," he instructed. "Keep your head below the bins." Her eyes flicked up to his. There was something about the calm in them that anchored her, the way a rock anchors the tide. "Sir." "You should sit. I will when it's safe." He turned toward the front, scanning the cabin. The older couple across the aisle were pale but stable. The businessman clutched his briefcase like a life vest. A mother in the second row whispered to her child, voice trembling. Michael's voice carried through the din, firm but even. "You're all fine. Just air pressure. Planes are built for this. Breathe slow." The effect was immediate. People listened. Fear shrank under command. In the cockpit, Amelia gripped the yoke tighter, her voice calm but clipped over the radio. "Control, this is Flight 218. We're experiencing severe crosswinds at 32,000. Requesting altitude adjustment." Static crackled. -218. Heavy traffic below. Maintain current altitude." She cursed under her breath. The airframe shuddered again, lightning flashing across the nose of the aircraft. Reyes glanced at her tension in his jaw. "Downdraft coming in fast," he warned. "I see it." Amelia's voice was steel. "Hold trim. We'll ride it out." The nose dipped again, violently this time. Half the cabin screamed. The oxygen masks jolted from their housings, but dangled uselessly for a second, before retracting back. Michael held Sophie close, her small face buried against his chest. His voice was steady, calm, a lifeline through the chaos. "Hey, I've got you. Eyes on me. Okay, you're safe. I'm scared," she whispered. "I know, but remember what we talked about." She nodded weakly. "Courage doesn't mean you're not scared," he said. "It means you keep your eyes open anyway." She blinked through tears and did just that. The turbulence lasted only minutes, but felt eternal. Slowly the jolt softened. The engines steadied. The plane leveled. Amelia's voice came back firm but soothing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've passed through the worst of it. You are safe. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign turns off." A quiet ripple of applause followed relief disguised as gratitude. Michael exhaled slowly, brushing a stray hair from Sophie's forehead. "See, just a bump in the sky." She smiled shakily. "You didn't even look scared?" He chuckled. "That's because I've seen worse bumps." A few minutes later, Tessa returned her arm bandaged with gauze from the med kit. She crouched beside his seat. "You should have stayed put. You could have been hurt." He shrugged. "Old habits die hard." She smiled faintly. "You were right about pressure. It stopped bleeding fast." He nodded. "That's training, not luck." She tilted her head. "You were something else before all this, weren't you?" He smiled. "Just someone who's had a long flight." Her eyes softened. "Well, for what it's worth. Thanks. You don't owe me that," he said quietly. "Just pass it forward next time someone needs a calm voice." She nodded, then straightened her composure, returning. In the cockpit, Amelia checked the instruments and smiled faintly when Reyes said, The cabin's calm again. Feels like they trust you. She shook her head. Not me. Him. Who she glanced at the passenger manifest still open on her console, her eyes resting on a single name, Michael Bray. He stabilized the cabin faster than the autopilot did. Reyes chuckled. Guess SEALs never retire. Amelia didn't answer. Her gaze drifted toward the reflection in the glass, his silhouette faintly visible through the curtain, Sophie asleep again against his arm. When the turbulence was truly over, and the clouds broke to reveal a velvet blue night scattered with stars, Amelia made one final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be landing on time. Sometimes turbulence reminds us that calm isn't the absence of chaos. It's how we meet it. Michael smiled faintly at that. He looked down at Sophie, now fast asleep again, and whispered, She's got a way with words. The businessman across the aisle, once judgmental, leaned over quietly. You were amazing back there, he said. You kept everyone together. Michael shook his head. I just reminded them to breathe. The pilot did the rest. No, the man said, his voice low with humility. You reminded me to listen. Michael said nothing, only gave a small nod. As the engines hummed on, the tension dissolved into gratitude. People relaxed. A few even smiled at one another. And somewhere between the fading storm and the calm horizon, Michael felt something he hadn't in years, an old rhythm returning to his chest. Not adrenaline. Not fear. Purpose. For the first time since leaving the Navy, he realized he hadn't lost his strength. He'd simply changed how he used it. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was something rarer, a quiet hero who kept the sky steady even when it trembled. The first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon as Flight 218 began its descent toward Washington, D.C. The night storm had passed, leaving behind a soft, amber calm. The world below shimmered faintly beneath scattered clouds, city lights fading under the promise of morning. Inside the cabin, everything felt changed. Not louder or brighter, just lighter. The kind of peace that follows shared fear, the quiet understanding that no one leaves a storm the same way they entered it. Michael Bray looked out the window, his reflection half mirrored in the glass. The turbulence had smoothed his exhaustion into calm. Beside him, Sophie stirred, rubbing her eyes and smiling faintly. Are we there, Daddy? Almost Peanut, he said gently. You made it through the night. She yawned, then grinned. Did we really fly through a storm? He nodded. You were braver than half the people in this cabin. Her small hand squeezed his. I wasn't scared. Not when you were holding me. Michael smiled, but the words hit deeper than she knew. At the front of the plane, Captain Amelia Hart guided the aircraft toward the runway lights gleaming in the distance. Her co-pilot Reyes gave her a quick nod. Smooth air ahead. Ground's ready for us. Amelia's gaze flicked to the cabin door beyond the cockpit. It's been a flight people won't forget. Reyes smirked. Especially you, Captain. She didn't answer. Her fingers traced the edge of her headset absently. In all her years flying, she had learned that turbulence wasn't always in the clouds, it lived inside people too. Some storms weren't meant to be avoided, but faced. She adjusted the intercom switch. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. The gentle chime echoed through the cabin, and Tessa Morgan stood, her arms still bandaged from the night before. Her usual poise had returned, but something in her demeanor had softened a quiet humility. As she walked the aisle, she noticed passengers smiling at one another, whispering words of relief. No one was laughing cruelly anymore. The arrogance that had filled first-class hours earlier had dissolved into something rare gratitude. When she reached row 1, she paused beside Michael and Sophie. We'll be landing in 10 minutes, she said softly. Sophie smiled up at her. Thank you for being brave. Tessa blinked, touched. Oh, sweetheart, I think your dad deserves that title. Sophie shook her head with conviction. Daddy says bravery is catching. Michael looked up, meeting Tessa's eyes with quiet warmth. She's right about that. Tessa smiled faintly. You make people feel safe, Mr. Bray. He shook his head. I just remind them they already are. Her throat tightened. I hope you never stop doing that. He smiled gently. Neither should you. The wheels met the runway with a soft thud, followed by the rising hum of reverse thrust. The plane slowed steady and sure. A collective sigh filled the cabin, relief mingled with awe. When the seatbelt sign blinked off, something unusual happened. Applause. It started from the back, a tentative clap from one passenger, then another, until it spread forward in a wave of gratitude that filled the entire cabin. But this wasn't the polite applause travelers gave for smooth landings. This was different. It was for him. Amelia Hart emerged from the cockpit still in uniform, her expression composed, yet luminous. Tessa stood to one side watching her captain approach the first-class cabin again, but this time not as a commander, rather as a witness. The applause quieted as Amelia stopped before Michael's seat. The morning light framed her silhouette, her cap tucked beneath her arm. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady. I owe you all thanks for your patience during last night's storm. But there's one passenger here who reminded me and all of us what real calm looks like. Michael frowned, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Captain. That's not necessary. Amelia raised a hand gently. It is. She turned to the cabin. This man was once a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy SEALs. He carried out missions that kept skies like this one safe. And when he left the uniform behind, he didn't stop serving. He just found quieter ways to do it. The cabin was utterly silent. Even the engines seemed to hum softer. Amelia's voice softened, filled with something like awe. Last night, when fear took over, it was his voice that steadied this aircraft. When others doubted, he reminded us to believe. And years ago, long before this flight, he saved the lives of men and women who wear this country's wings. She turned back to Michael, her eyes glistening. If there's anyone who deserves to sit in seat 1A today, it's you, Lieutenant Bray. The passengers rose one by one, their applause deepening, not the frantic clapping of surprise, but a slow, sincere standing ovation. Tessa's chin trembled as she joined them. The businessman from earlier bowed his head. Even the woman with the pearl earrings wiped a tear from her cheek. Sophie, wide-eyed, turned to her father. Daddy, they're clapping for you. Michael swallowed hard, emotion rising against the walls of his composure. No, Peanut, he whispered, his voice breaking just slightly. They're clapping for everyone who still believes people can be better. He stood slowly nodding to the crowd, not proud, not boastful, just grateful. Amelia straightened, saluting him once more, but this time not as a superior officer, nor as a pilot to a soldier. It was human to human, equal to equal. Michael returned the gesture quietly. The moment was simple, powerful, sacred. As the passengers began to disembark, Tessa lingered at the door. When Michael reached her, she held out a small card, the airline's feedback form, but there was writing already on it. It's not a form, she said shyly. Just a note. I think I needed to say thank you properly. He took it, unfolding the small square of paper. Inside, written in neat, careful handwriting. I learned that service doesn't always wear stripes. Some heroes carry mops instead of medals. Michael smiled softly. Keep flying, Tessa. The world needs your kind of sky. Her eyes glistened. And it needs your kind of ground. He nodded and stepped onto the jet bridge, holding Sophie's hand. The air smelled of coffee and morning rain. Behind him, Amelia called out Lieutenant Michael. He turned. She stood framed in the aircraft doorway, sunlight touching her shoulder. If you ever want to see the sky from up here again, I'll make sure there's always a seat." Michael smiled, tipping an invisible cap. "Careful, Captain. I might take you up on that someday." Amelia's grin was quiet but certain. "I hope you do." As they walked down the terminal, Sophie looked up at him. "Daddy." "Yeah, Peanut. Do you think people will remember today?" He squeezed her hand. "Maybe not the way it happened, but they'll remember how it felt." "How did it feel?" she asked. He looked toward the rising sun beyond the glass. Like landing with grace. Behind them, the last of the passengers stepped off the plane, some still whispering about the quiet man with the tattoo, the little girl, and the pilot who saluted him. Stories like that don't end when the plane touches down. They just find new ways to take flight. Washington, D.C. shimmered in the soft gold of a late afternoon sun. The city was alive with its usual pulse horns, footsteps, and the echo of ambition in every direction. Yet for Michael Bray, standing outside the modest apartment he shared with Sophie, the world felt quieter than it ever had before. The flight had ended days ago, but its echoes hadn't faded. Something in him had shifted, as if the turbulence had shaken loose a piece of his past he'd buried too deep. He checked the mailbox, mostly bills and circulars, but one envelope stood out. Thick cream paper, elegant handwriting. The return address bore a familiar name, Captain Amelia Hart. He froze for a moment before tearing it open. "Lieutenant Bray, I hope this letter finds you well. There are moments in life when the universe insists on closing a circle, and I believe Flight 218 was one of those moments. You once carried me through fire. I thought you should know you didn't just save my life. You changed the way I fly. Enclosed is something that belongs to you. I came across it while reviewing the archives of Operation Ironhaven. It seems history forgot to give you the credit you deserved. With respect and gratitude, Amelia." Inside the envelope was a folded photocopy of an old mission report, yellowed stamped, classified, declassified, and beneath it a single handwritten note. "Lieutenant Michael Bray, for exemplary bravery in the rescue of pilot Amelia Hart, May 2010. Michael stared at the words for a long while, his fingers trembling slightly. The report was short, 3 paragraphs, but it was enough to unearth memories long sealed under layers of silence and humility. He sat down at the kitchen table, the late light spilling across the page. Sophie was drawing at the other end, her crayon squeaking softly against the paper. "What's that, Daddy?" she asked, peering up at him. He folded the letter gently. "Just something from an old friend." "From the pilot lady," he smiled. "Yeah, the pilot lady. Is she nice?" "She's brave," he said, pausing. "And honest." Sophie nodded wisely. "Like you." He chuckled, though his throat felt tight. "Not exactly. She still flies. I just clean up the hangars." Sophie tilted her head. "But you cleaned her sky." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than anything Amelia could have written. He looked at her. His small miracle born from loss and laughter, the reason he'd learned to stop running from life. "Yeah," he whispered. "I guess I did." That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Michael stepped out onto the small balcony. The city lights glimmered below like scattered embers. The hum of life felt distant, but comforting. He unfolded the letter again and read it by the glow of a street lamp. He'd never been one for honors. The medals, the ceremonies, they'd belonged to a version of him that died somewhere in the Gulf. But this letter wasn't about recognition. It was about remembrance. And somehow, it felt heavier than any medal could. He pulled out an old wooden box from the closet, a keepsake he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay photos, faded by time, a younger man in fatigues, a group of seals grinning in mud and rain, a woman holding a baby, wrapped in a pink blanket, his late wife Lena smiling at the camera. He traced her face with his thumb. "You'd like Amelia," he murmured. "Same kind of fire." The wind stirred the papers on the table, fluttering Amelia's letter. For a moment, he imagined Lena's voice in the rustle. "You've been forgiven long enough. Maybe it's time to be seen again." The next morning, as Sophie ate pancakes drowned in syrup, a knock came at the door. Michael opened it to find a courier holding a small package. No return label, just a simple seal, with the emblem of the Department of Defense. Delivery for Mr. Michael Bray. He signed and closed the door, curiosity prickling. Inside the box was a black velvet case, and beneath it a card with a single line written in Amelia's precise script, "For what you left behind." He opened the case slowly. Inside was a tarnished Navy Medal of Valor, his own, the one he'd refused to accept a decade ago. A lump caught in his throat. He'd never asked how she'd found it. Some things didn't need explaining. He placed the medal on the table beside Sophie's crayon drawing from the night before, a stick figure of him, her and a woman in a pilot's hat. "She's part of our family now," Sophie said, proudly pointing to the picture. He smiled softly. "I guess she is." That afternoon he sat down with pen and paper, something he hadn't done in years. Words came haltingly at first then, in steady rhythm. "Captain Hart, I read your letter. You didn't have to send this, but I'm grateful you did. You were right. Flight 218 was more than a trip. It was a reminder. I've spent years believing I needed to disappear to be at peace. Turns out peace finds you when you stop hiding from what made you. You said I changed the way you fly. Well, you reminded me why I stopped running. That's a fair trade. If you ever fly west, there's a diner near the harbor in San Diego that serves the worst coffee and the best sunsets. Bring your wings. The coffee's on me. Respectfully, Michael." He sealed the letter, but for a long time he didn't mail it. It sat by the window for days, catching sunlight, absorbing dust, like it was waiting for the right wind. A week later, the doorbell rang again. Sophie opened it before he could. Standing there, no uniform, no cap, was Amelia Hart. She smiled softly at the sight of them. "I was passing through. Thought I'd take you up on that coffee." Michael blinked, stunned. That was fast mail. "I'm a pilot," she said, stepping inside. We skipped lines. Sophie giggled and rushed forward, hugging her around the waist. "I drew you a new picture." Amelia knelt to meet her eyes. "Can I see it?" Sophie handed her the crayon masterpiece. Amelia smiled, her eyes softening as she traced the stick figure with wings. "Looks like I finally made it to the right sky." Michael chuckled. "She's got an artist's honesty." They sat at the kitchen table, 2 cups of black coffee steaming between them. For a while, they didn't talk about medals or missions or ghosts. They talked about Sophie's school project, about the smell of jet fuel, about simple things, the kind that make life bearable again. When Amelia rose to leave, she set something on the table, a small metal tag, engraved with words that gleamed under the light. "Some heroes don't return to the sky because they're already keeping it steady from below." Michael looked up at her. "You didn't have to, I know," she said softly. "But you did." He stood, shook her hand, and for the first time in years, felt the weight of gratitude without shame. As she walked away, Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, will she come back?" He smiled, watching Amelia's silhouette fade into the sunlight outside. "I think some people never really leave Peanut. They just change altitudes." And in the soft hush of that Sunday morning, with the letter still open on the table, and the city waking below them, Michael realized something simple, yet profound. Respect isn't something you earn. Once it's something you give every day, quietly, in how you live. The air along the San Diego harbor smelled of salt, engine oil, and memory. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries threading through the clinking of masts and the rhythm of waves against old wooden hulls. Michael Bray stood by the pier, sleeves rolled up, hands slick with grease, as he tightened a bolt on an aging motorboat. The craft belonged to a fellow veteran who couldn't afford repairs, and Michael had promised to help just for the cost of a sandwich. It was Sunday, his quiet day. Sophie sat on a crate nearby, feeding breadcrumbs to a pelican that eyed her warily. Her laughter mingled with the lap of the tide. "Careful, Peanut," Michael said without looking up. "You'll have that bird thinking you're its full-time chef." She giggled. "He's polite. He says thank you with his eyes." Michael chuckled under his breath. Wish people did the same. He stood wiping his hands on a rag. The morning sun caught the streaks of silver in his hair. Years of war work and worry had etched lines into his face, but they suited him now. They weren't signs of age. They were proof of endurance. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You still fixing everyone else's storms?" He turned. Amelia Hart stood there, dressed simply in jeans and a navy jacket, her aviator sunglasses reflecting the water. He smiled. "Captain Hart? I thought the sky had claimed you permanently." She grinned. "I grounded myself for a day. The clouds can wait." Sophie's face lit up. The pilot lady Amelia laughed, crouching down to hug her. "Hey, co-pilot, feeding the troops." "Only the hungry ones," Sophie replied proudly. Michael crossed his arms, amused. "You two get along like old friends." Amelia straightened her gaze, meeting his. "Feels that way, doesn't it?" He nodded toward the cafe at the corner of the pier. "I owe you coffee, remember?" She smiled. "I remember every promise you make, Lieutenant." The cafe was small, tucked between a bait shop and a rusted lighthouse post. Inside, the air was rich with roasted beans and the murmur of early customers. They took a table by the window overlooking the harbor. Amelia stirred her coffee absently. "You still call me Captain in your letters." "Force of habit," Michael said with a faint grin. "You'll always be the one steering the ship." She shook her head. "Maybe. But lately I've been thinking you're the one keeping it afloat." He raised a brow. "That sounds dangerously close to flattery." "It's not," she said. "It's recognition." He looked out the window where Sophie was outside chatting with a fisherman about pelicans. "Recognition is overrated. Peace is better." "Do you really have it?" she asked softly. He thought for a moment. "Some days, yes. Other days I wake up expecting the sound of rotor blades." Amelia nodded. "I know the feeling. The silence after combat is the loudest sound there is." They sat in quiet companionship, the kind that doesn't need to fill silence with words. After a while, Amelia reached into her jacket and slid a small folder across the table. "I brought you something." Michael frowned, opening it. Inside were several photographs, grainy, taken years ago. One showed a rescue chopper hovering above black waves, spotlights cutting through chaos. Another captured a man, him carrying a limp pilot through the surf. He froze. "Where did you get these Pentagon archives?" she said. "They were buried under non-essential documentation. I thought you'd want to see proof of what the world forgot." Michael traced the photo edges with his calloused thumb. "You kept these?" She smiled faintly. Someone had to remember the right version of the story. He looked up. "I didn't think I'd ever want to." "Then why are you smiling?" He laughed softly, caught off guard. "Because maybe I'm proud. And that feels strange." "It's allowed, you know," she said gently, "to forgive yourself for surviving." He looked at her eyes, warm but waited. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," Amelia said, "but it's worth doing." They finished their coffee, slowly talking about small things the color of the morning sky. Sophie's drawings, the old SEAL base that had been turned into a rehabilitation center. Amelia told him she'd been invited to give a speech at an Air Force academy about leadership under pressure. "They want me to talk about courage," she said, rolling her eyes, as if courage is something you can put in a PowerPoint. Michael smiled. "You'll say the right thing. I don't know what that is anymore." He leaned back, thoughtful. "Tell them the truth, that courage doesn't always look like charging forward. Sometimes, it's knowing when to stop fighting." She studied him for a moment, the sunlight catching the edges of her hair. You talk like a man who's figured out what life means, he chuckled. Nah, I just stopped trying to outsmart it. Outside, Sophie ran along the dock, chasing her own laughter. The pelican followed from a distance, squawking like a loyal bodyguard. Amelia watched her for a long while. You've done something incredible with her. Michael turned to the window. She did it herself. I just made sure she had a soft place to land. Amelia smiled. I envy that. My world's always been takeoff and turbulence, never landing. He met her gaze. Then maybe it's time you learn. The words lingered between them, not romantic, not yet, but full of quiet gravity. They left the cafe and walked the pier together. The ocean was calm, now the sky wide and clear. Do you ever miss the noise? Amelia asked. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I hear Sophie laugh, and it's the only sound I need. She nodded, her expression soft. I used to think strength meant never slowing down. You made me realize it's the opposite, he smiled. Took me half a lifetime to learn that lesson. Might as well pass it on. Amelia stopped, looking out at the horizon where the sun met the sea. You know, I think the world's better with you back in it. He looked at her, his voice quiet. I never really left. I just changed uniforms. She laughed softly. And here, I thought I was the one teaching you about grace. He turned toward her, eyes kind. You did. You just didn't know it. As they reached the end of the pier, Sophie came running, holding a small seashell. Daddy, look, it's shaped like a heart. Michael knelt, taking it gently. The edges were rough, uneven, but beautiful in its imperfection. Keep it safe, he said, placing it in her hand. Some things get stronger, the more weather they survive. Amelia watched the moment quietly, her heart tightening with something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. Michael glanced up at her, his voice low but certain. You know, Captain, you don't always have to fly to feel free. She smiled. And you don't have to wear medals to be seen. They stood together as the waves rolled beneath them, the sunlight spilling across the water like liquid gold. And in that small, quiet harbor, between a man who had learned to forgive himself, a woman who had learned to land, and a child who believed in kindness, the world felt briefly, beautifully at peace. Autumn had come quietly to Washington. The trees along the mall blushed in hues of amber and rust, and the air carried that soft chill that hinted at change. The world felt slower somehow, like even the city's relentless rhythm had taken a breath. Michael Bray walked the familiar path toward the Veterans Center, Sophie's small hand tucked securely in his. The invitation had come a week earlier, a formal letter embossed with the seal of the Department of Defense. You are hereby invited to attend the Veterans Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Recognition Lieutenant Michael Bray for distinguished service and valor during Operation Iron Haven. He hadn't planned to go. He had told himself medals were just reminders of ghosts. But Sophie's eyes had widened when she read the letter aloud. Daddy, they want to thank you. You have to go. He'd smiled gently, ruffling her hair. Sweetheart, I don't need to stand on a stage to know who I am. But she'd tilted her head, her tone both innocent and wise. Maybe it's not about you knowing, Daddy. Maybe it's about them remembering. That had stayed with him. And now, as he neared the entrance of the great memorial grounds, the thought still echoed in his chest. The ceremony grounds were a sea of flags and uniforms, the air filled with the distant hum of a brass band warming up. Rows of white chairs stretched across the green, dotted with veterans of every generation, old men in faded caps, young soldiers with prosthetics and quiet eyes. Michael felt the weight of all those lives, each carrying a story, a sacrifice, a name whispered in the silence of night. Sophie squeezed his hand tighter. Daddy, are you nervous? He smiled softly. Only when I'm not holding your hand. A familiar voice called out from behind. Then you must be fearless. He turned. Amelia Hart approached, dressed in her navy dress, blues medals, catching the morning light. Her smile was calm, but her eyes carried a warmth he hadn't seen since that flight. Captain, he greeted, his tone, equal parts, respect and affection. Michael, she corrected, her grin softening. No ranks today, just people. She looked down at Sophie, and how's my co-pilot? Sophie saluted dramatically. Reporting for duty, ma'am. Amelia laughed, returning the salute. Looks like you outrank us both. Michael chuckled, the sound low and genuine. Don't give her ideas. As they took their seats among the rows, Amelia leaned slightly toward him. They're presenting you with your Medal of Valor today. Officially this time. Michael's gaze stayed on the stage ahead where the podium gleamed under the sunlight. It's just metal. The real medals didn't survive the sea. She studied him quietly. You really believe that? He nodded. I already have everything that matters. I've got her. He tilted his head towards Sophie. And peace, finally. Amelia's eyes softened. Peace is the rarest medal there is. They fell silent as the ceremony began. The speeches came first, standard words about bravery, duty, sacrifice. But when the announcer spoke his name, Lieutenant Michael Bray, the crowd turned, their applause swelling like a slow-rising tide. He stood reluctantly every step toward the stage, feeling heavier than the last. Sophie's encouragement followed him like sunlight. You got this, Daddy. The officer on stage smiled broadly, holding a velvet box. Lieutenant Bray. It's an honor to correct an oversight 10 years overdue. Your courage during Operation Iron Haven saved American lives. You exemplify the highest ideals of service and humanity. Michael accepted the medal with steady hands but shook his head. Sir, I appreciate the honor, but I didn't come here to collect what was already spent. The crowd murmured softly, unsure what he meant. He turned to face them, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who had learned humility through pain. This medal belongs to a team, he said, to men who didn't make it home, to families who kept faith when we couldn't call, to people who clean hangars, drive trucks, raise kids, and keep the lights of this country burning when the rest of us lose our way. He glanced at Sophie, who sat upright in the front row, eyes shining with pride. I don't need this medal to feel honored, he continued, because my daughter already gave me the only award that matters, a reason to live better. The audience was silent. Even the flags seemed to hold their breath. Then Amelia rose from her seat, stepping forward. With respect, Lieutenant, she said, her voice strong and sure. The medal isn't for you, it's for her. So she'll always know what you stood for. Sophie looked from Amelia to her father, eyes wide. Daddy, please keep it. For me, he hesitated, then exhaled slowly. Well, he said, softly smiling down at her. How can I argue with my commanding officer? The crowd laughed softly, a ripple of warmth breaking through the solemn air. Michael pinned the medal not to his chest, but to Sophie's small denim jacket. Then it's yours, Peanut. Just don't wear it to school, it might cause trouble. She giggled. Can I tell them it's from saving a pilot? He winked. Only if you tell them she's the boss now. Amelia stood beside them, the sunlight catching her face. She leaned close and whispered, You know that's the most graceful refusal I've ever seen. He smiled. Not a refusal, Captain. Just a transfer of command. Later, when the ceremony ended, they walked together through the rows of marble headstones, the sound of distant bagpipes floating through the air. The world seemed suspended in a reverent kind of quiet. Amelia stopped by one stone, marked with names familiar to them both. You ever wonder why we made it out and they didn't? She asked softly. Michael's eyes traced the carved letters. Every day. But I stopped looking for reasons. Now I just try to live in a way that honors them. She nodded slowly. You do. More than you know. He turned to her, his expression open and honest. You remind me of what's left worth believing in. Amelia smiled, but there was something fragile in it. And you remind me what landing looks like. They stood in silence, the wind stirring the fallen leaves around them. Sophie ran ahead, chasing the orange whirl of a leaf caught midair. Her laughter drifted through the graveyard like a hymn, innocent, pure, the sound of life continuing. Michael watched her, then turned back to Amelia. I don't know what's next, but I'm done disappearing. Good, she said, because the world needs people like you, visible again. He looked down at the metal gleaming on Sophie's jacket, then back at her. Maybe it needs people like us. Amelia smiled gently. Maybe that's the promise. As they left the cemetery, the sun broke fully through the clouds, pouring golden light over the field of white stones. Sophie looked up, tugging her father's hand. Daddy? Yeah, Peanut. Do medals get heavy? He thought for a moment. Only if you forget why you wear them, she smiled. Then I'll remember. He squeezed her hand. That's my girl. Amelia walked beside them, silent but smiling. The three of them moved through the long shadows of afternoon soldier pilot and child, each carrying a different piece of the same promise that courage and kindness would never go out of style. A year passed. The seasons folded one into another, winter's hush, spring's awakening, summer's hum. And through them all, Michael Bray found himself learning something he had never known before: the art of ordinary happiness. He still worked at the airport, but now the janitor's uniform carried a quiet dignity. People greeted him differently, not because they knew who he had been, but because they could feel who he was. There was kindness in his eyes, steadiness in his step, and a rare calm that only comes from a man who has made peace with himself. Every morning he would stop by the diner near Gout 12, where Sophie loved the pancakes, and the waitress knew their order by heart. Sometimes Amelia joined them when she had layovers in the city. The three of them would sit by the window, watching planes rise into the dawn. Sophie called them skybirds. Michael called them promises. Now it was November. Again, Veterans Day 1 year later. This time, the invitation came not from the Department of Defense, but from Amelia herself. The envelope bore the simple crest of the National Veterans Honor Council, and inside was a handwritten note. Michael, they're holding a tribute ceremony in D.C. this year. They'd like you to speak. I know you don't like stages, but this one isn't about medals. It's about voices that deserve to be heard. I'll be in the front row. Sophie, too. It would mean something if you were there. He had stared at the letter for a long time before folding it carefully. Now, as he adjusted the simple navy blazer Sophie had insisted he wear, he caught his reflection in the mirror, older, maybe, but lighter, somehow. The ghosts no longer hid behind his eyes. They had learned to rest. Sophie tugged his sleeve impatiently. Daddy, hurry, you'll be late. He chuckled, grabbing his worn leather briefcase. You sound like your mom used to. She beamed. That means I'm doing it right. The auditorium at the Washington Memorial Center was filled to the brim. Rows of service members sat shoulder to shoulder, their medals glinting under the lights. Families filled the balcony seats, their faces bright with pride and longing. Michael stood behind the curtain waiting for his cue. He could see Amelia from a distance, elegant in her dress, blues her silver wings pinned neatly to her lapel. Sophie sat beside her legs, swinging, eyes shining. Next up, the announcer said, is a man whose story reminds us that valor isn't measured by uniforms, but by heart. Please welcome Lieutenant Michael Bray. The applause rolled like distant thunder. Michael took a steady breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights felt warm against his skin, but it wasn't the blinding warmth of attention. It was the kind that welcomes like morning sunlight through an open window. He began quietly. "Good evening." A pause. He smiled faintly, scanning the crowd. "That's the first time anyone's ever called me lieutenant in a janitor's uniform." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room, easing the tension. He continued, voice low but clear. "When I left the Navy, I thought I was done serving. I traded in a rifle for a mop the sky for the floor, and I thought that was the end of my story. But a year ago, I learned something different. Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes, it just changes shape." The audience leaned in. Even the cameras stopped clicking. He spoke of that flight, the misunderstanding, the salute, the storm. He spoke of humility, of Sophie's courage, of Amelia's grace. "People ask me if it felt good to be recognized," he said. "But recognition was never the point. The real honor came from seeing people remember what respect looks like. A salute isn't about rank, it's about acknowledgement. It's saying, 'I see you.' And for years I thought I'd lost that. Turns out I just needed to see others first." He paused, letting the words settle. In the crowd, Amelia's eyes glistened. Sophie held her mother's hand tightly. Michael continued, his tone softening. "I used to believe that life after war was survival. But it's more than that. It's about choosing love over bitterness, hope over regret. It's about teaching our children that strength doesn't mean fighting harder. It means healing deeper." He took a breath, his voice catching slightly. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't need to sit in first class to matter. You don't need a title to be respected. You just need to live in a way that earns the seat you're in." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then came the sound of applause, slow, deliberate, powerful. Not thunderous, but heartfelt. People rose to their feet, veterans, civilians, officers, children, all united by something wordless. Amelia stood first, her gaze never leaving him. When he stepped down from the stage, she was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. That she said softly was the best flight you've ever taken. He smiled. "You kept your promise, you were in the front row." She laughed quietly. "Always." Sophie ran into his arms, the medal she'd worn last year still pinned to her little jacket. "Daddy, you were amazing. Everyone was listening." He crouched, pulling her close. "You think so, I know." So she said, eyes shining, "You made people feel things, like you do with me." He kissed her forehead, whispering, "Then I did my job." Later, after the crowd dispersed, the three of them stood by the great windows overlooking the city. The Lincoln Memorial shimmered in the distance, its reflection stretching across the calm water. Amelia leaned beside him. "You realize you've started something, right? They'll be calling you for every veterans event from now until you're 80. He grinned. "Guess I'll need new shoes." She laughed, then grew quiet. "Michael, what you said out there, earning the seat you're in, that hit me. I've spent half my life chasing altitude. Maybe it's time I learned to land somewhere." He turned toward her, eyes soft. "You already did. Right here." Their eyes met, no grand gestures, no declarations. Just the quiet certainty of two souls who had fought their way back to grace. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep in the back seat of Amelia's car, they drove through the quiet streets of Washington. The city lights gleamed off the windshield, each one a small reminder of how far they'd come. At a red light, Amelia glanced over. "You ever think you'd end up here?" He shook his head. "Not once." "Do you regret leaving the Navy?" He thought about it for a long moment. "No," he said, finally. "Because if I hadn't, I'd never have met you. Or seen what love looks like when it's brave." Amelia smiled, her voice soft. "Respect doesn't need a uniform." He looked out the window, the words echoing through him like a hymn. "And love," he said, "doesn't need perfect timing." The next morning, as sunlight spilled over the Potomac, Michael stood on the balcony of his apartment, coffee in hand. Sophie still slept inside her small form, curled under her blanket. He watched the sky, clear, endless, forgiving. Somewhere up there, a plane cut across the blue, leaving a trail of silver light. He didn't envy it anymore. He didn't long to fly. Because for the first time in his life, he finally understood. He was already exactly where he was meant to be. And as the wind brushed against his face, he whispered the words that had carried him through every storm, his own quiet creed. Respect doesn't need a uniform. Love doesn't need a perfect timing. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from today? Tell us your city or country in the comments below. It's always heartwarming to know how far these stories travel. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life tales about kindness, courage, and the quiet strength that connects us all. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that bring light into everyday lives. Thank you truly for spending your time with us. Until the next story, take care of yourself, be kind to others, and remember, even the smallest act of compassion can change someone's world.